there you lot, time for another video. As you may have seen in my last video about my recent mental health break, I picked up this not long ago. A 2GB version of the HD 5570 from ATI/AMD. Specifically, this version is by XFX, and as mentioned features 2GB of GDDR3 memory and has a TDP of 39 watts. It was part of the HD 5000 series of cards, and was in the same market segment as the HD 5450 and 5550. It was essentially the exact same as the faster 5670, but this one came with GDDR3 rather than the 5670's GDDR5, and also had a lower clock speed as well. Although there were versions of the 5570 that also came with GDDR5 and some with DDR2 memory as well. I'm unsure of the launch date and price for this specific model, but the reference HD 5570 with 1GB of memory released on February 9th, 2010 at a price of around $80 US, which after inflation is around $94 US today, which is also around £74 or €83 today. That aside, the 2GB version we have here cost me only £8 from CEX in the UK. In terms of buying it in America though, it's so outrageously priced on ebay.com that I really wouldn't feel right telling you to buy it. As usual, I'll be running it through some relatively modern games to show what kind of performance it could offer, if you're looking to play modern games on a budget. Before that though, let's run through some of the specs first. It ran on the Redwood graphics core, the Redwood Pro variant specifically, using the Terascale 2 architecture, and ran at 650MHz, with 2GB of GDDR3 memory on a 128-bit wide bus, running at a speed of 800MHz, effectively 1600MHz because of how the memory works. It featured 627 million transistors built on the 40nm fabrication process, and had 5 compute units, 400 shading units, 20 texture mapping units and 8 raster operations pipelines, and also had 256KB of L2 cache, with 8KB of L1 cache per compute unit. It carried support for DirectX 11 as well as OpenGL 4.4 and OpenCL 1.2, and had one DVI, one VGA and one HDMI connector. It also required no external PCIe power connector either, so can run on a wide range of systems. The rest of the system we'll be using today features an i7 6700K, overclocked to 4.8 GHz on all cores, a MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, 16GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 RAM, overclocked to 2800 MHz, and a fully updated install of Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. The games are also running from a mechanical hard drive, so let's get on with the tests. First up is GTA 5, which as you can probably see, I'm only running at 720p here, with a mix of high/normal settings. Detailed settings are in the description below. I did try 1080p, but even at the lowest possible settings, the game was extremely difficult to play due to how severe the input locking is, making driving pretty much impossible, and caused me to give up entirely on benchmarking it. That aside, 720p ran well enough to be playable. FPS in the city was around 26 to 36 FPS and had no noticeable stuttering or locking up at all, nor did it have any issues with input lag or locking either. On the highway heading out towards the desert area of the game, the FPS even hit 41, and overall the game ran relatively smoothly and was definitely playable. The benchmark showed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 33, 27 and 24 FPS respectively. The frametime graph also shows that there were several parts of the game that dipped below 30 FPS, and there were some spikes in frame times to around 40 milliseconds, although I don't think these were particularly noticeable, if at all. CSGO, or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, was another story entirely. It ran relatively great at 1080p and even better at 720p, both using medium settings with 16x anisotropic filtering and a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. 1080p throughout the map managed FPS in the 50 to 76 FPS range, depending on the location of the map you're in and if you are indoors or outdoors, with 720p managing to hit as high as the mid-120s and dropping no lower than 64 FPS. There was no noticeable input lag or locking at either resolution. 1080p, despite how well it performed, did in fact show one very brief but noticeable stutter during the test, but was fine otherwise. 720p had no such issue and was visibly far smoother than 1080p. The benchmark showed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 54, 30 and 21 FPS respectively at 1080p. with multiple spikes in frame times throughout of up to 40 milliseconds, with some more reaching 60 milliseconds. 720p on the other hand managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 87, 49 and 34 FPS respectively, with a couple spikes in frame times hitting 40 milliseconds, and some more of around 50 to 60 milliseconds. At stock clocks, Rise of the Tomb Raider was an absolute horror show at 1080p, so I'm running a test at 720p and 800 by 600 respectively, using the lowest settings possible with DirectX 11 mode enabled. At 720p, I noticed a huge amount of input lag straight away. It was so bad that it made combat extremely difficult. FPS was no higher than 16 at the start of the test, although 800 by 600 was able to hit the mid-20s at the start. It still had some input lag, although it was far less than 720p. The Soviet installation was pretty jarring to play through at 720p, with FPS tending to sit around 15 to 20, and hitting as high as 25, although, to be fair, that was while standing still, talking to an NPC to get a quest. 800 by 600 though, had FPS sitting in the 23 to 30 FPS range, and hitting 38 FPS while talking to the same NPC. Performance in the copper mill at 1080p was pretty much the same as it was in the Soviet installation, with FPS no higher than the mid-20s and lows as bad as 12 FPS at one point, and overall was a very jarring experience. 800 by 600 managed 20 to 30 FPS throughout the copper mill, and dropped as low as 18 frames per second. Despite the dips, it was far smoother than 720p was, and was far more playable as well. 720p managed 18, 12 and 9 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with multiple spikes in frame times throughout the test reaching around 80 milliseconds, more of around 80 to 120 milliseconds, and some at nearly 160 milliseconds. 800 by 600 managed benchmark figures of 26, 18 and 13 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had multiple spikes throughout the test of around 60 to 100 milliseconds, some more reaching up to 120 milliseconds and one of 140 milliseconds. It's by no means perfect, but compared to 720p, it's bordering on being playable. Lastly, before trying out the HD 5570's overclocking capabilities, it's Warframe, a game released in 2013, but one that continues to be extremely popular today. I'm running this at 1080p and 720p, with both using the lowest settings preset with film grain disabled. Both seem to run alright on the lander craft, with 1080p managing between the high 40s up to as high as the low 80s FPS wise, with 720p managing around 96 to around 162 FPS. 720p didn't show any noticeable locking up or stuttering here at all, but 1080p, looking back at it, had noticeable input lag for the entirety of the test, whereas 720p had no such issue. Meru's bizarre, given that it is an area where a lot of players can gather, can be quite difficult to run graphics-wise for lower-end hardware, and even higher-end stuff as well to a point. And it was no different in these tests, as at 1080p and 720p there was very noticeable stuttering and locking up and going into the area. 1080p also showed noticeable micro-stuttering, with the frame rate dipping into the low 30s at points, with 720p showing one brief lock-up inside Meru's, and also some minor but noticeable stutter as well. Both ran perfectly fine on the planet selection screen though. During the mission itself, 1080p's stuttery appearance, which looking at the frame time graph is caused by very inconsistent frame times, persisted. This also caused noticeable input lag throughout, which makes precise aiming cumbersome and frustrating. 720p though showed no issues at all with input lag, and the stuttery appearance was completely gone. FPS wise, 1080p managed figures as low as 31 FPS, but as high as the low 80s at points, but the inconsistent frame times I mentioned make it an uncomfortable experience at best. 720p though managed figures in the range of the low 60s to almost 130 FPS, which, coupled with there being no stutter, made for a pretty enjoyable test, and one in which you could up some of the settings and still get a perfectly playable experience. The benchmark at 1080p showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 49, 28 and 20 FPS respectively, with multiple spikes in frame times reaching 60 milliseconds. 720p managed a much more smooth 83, 54 and 34 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. The frame time graph does show multiple dips below 30 FPS at points, although, to me at least, these were unnoticeable. Back to GTA 5, and there was a huge improvement at 1080p. The HD5570 managed a highest stable clock in-game of 835 MHz on the core, and 845 MHz on the memory at 1080p, with 720p managing max stable clocks of 825 MHz on the core and 825 MHz on the memory. It was still completely unplayable though, but I was actually able to benchmark the game, which makes a huge difference to not being able to do so at all. 720p showed a minor improvement, but nothing really to write home about. Again, 1080p was run with the lowest settings possible, whereas 720p was using a mix of high/normal settings. At 1080p, FPS throughout the city was around the 17 to 20 FPS mark, and unfortunately still exhibited a noticeable amount of input locking and input lag as well, but far less than stock showed. 720p though showed a slight improvement here, with FPS now reaching up to 40 FPS throughout the city, up from the 36 FPS high previously. As well as still performing pretty poorly in the city, 1080p performed equally bad in the desert area as well, which also showed some noticeable input locking, making driving pretty difficult at times. But as I said, I was at least able to benchmark it this time round, so that's something I suppose. And like it did at stock, 720p performed relatively well here too, and overall had no noticeable issues with stuttering or locking up, nor did it show any signs of input lag or locking whatsoever, and ran pretty smooth throughout, showing the game to be reasonably playable at these settings and resolution. The benchmark for 1080p showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 20, 16 and 16 FPS respectively, with several spikes in frame times throughout of up to around 60 milliseconds, and more of around 70 to 80 milliseconds. 720p on the other hand showed reasonably playable results, with average 1% and 0.1% lows of 35, 29 and 25 FPS respectively. There were multiple frame time spikes throughout of up to around 40 to 50 milliseconds, and a couple of almost 60 milliseconds, showing that there was minor stuttering, although this was unnoticeable, at least to me anyway. With CSGO, there was a fairly notable improvement, with the biggest improvement coming at 720p. Stock clocks at both resolutions never really had any issues at all to start with, but the benchmarks show probably the largest improvement throughout all of the games tested today. In this game, the HD5570 managed highest stable clocks of 845 MHz on both the core and the memory, with 720p needing a drop to 835 MHz on the core to be stable. 1080p at stock had FPS hitting the mid-70s, but the overclock pushed this as high as 95 frames per second, which could make competitive play online a bit better. 720p was hitting 120 FPS at points, but was now getting up to 160 frames per second, which is a huge improvement, and one that would enable you to up the settings a fair bit and still achieve a more than playable experience. Neither had any issues with stuttering or locking up, nor did they have any issues with input lag or input locking either. And both showed the game to be quite playable and enjoyable as well. 1080p though did have one occasion in which the FPS dipped to the high 20s when there was a significant amount of fire on screen. There were no issues other than that though. 1080p showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 67, 37 and 26 FPS respectively, with multiple frame time spikes reaching up to around 40 milliseconds, with some more of up to 60 milliseconds. 720p had average 1% and 0.1% lows of 107, 63 and 43 frames per second, showing that, like I'd said, there's room for upping the settings here if you'd like. There were, however, multiple frame time spikes of up to 60 milliseconds, although these were unnoticeable. And last but not least, it's back to Warframe for the final game in the test today. The 5570 managed to remain stable with a higher core clock than the rest of the games, with 860 MHz being stable at both resolutions, and managing 845 MHz on the memory at 1080p. 720p needed a drop to 825 MHz on the memory to be stable. At stock, 1080p had major problems with input lag, caused by very inconsistent frame times that made the controls seem quite cumbersome to use, but that, thankfully, was massively reduced, other than in some very graphically intense scenes during the mission. It managed around 55 up to 110 FPS on the Landercraft, and had no noticeable locking up or stuttering here at all. 720p even got over 200 FPS on the Landercraft as well, with highs as high as the mid-220s. Both ran smoothly on the planet selection screen, and both still had noticeable locking up heading into Maru's Bazaar on Mars. 1080p possibly had some very minor micro stuttering in Maru's, but it was so minor that I couldn't quite tell if I was just imagining it or not. During the mission itself though, 1080p still dipped as low as 31 FPS at times, but could now reach over 110 FPS at best. And due to the reduction in the severity of how inconsistent the frame times were, it was a far better experience than it was at stock, although, as I mentioned, there was still some quite noticeable micro stuttering in the most graphically intense scenes. 720p though is where it's at if you want a pretty much perfect experience. FPS was around 87 up to as high as 220 FPS in the least detailed areas of the map. There were no issues with stutter or locking up that I saw, and there was no input lag or locking either, making for a great experience, leaving plenty of room to increase the settings if you want to. 1080p managed 60, 35 and 24 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. The frame times could still be pretty inconsistent at times though, evidenced by the noticeable stuttering in the most intense scenes. 720p managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 100, 59 and 41 FPS respectively, with frame times that could also be inconsistent at times, but not to the point I was able to actually notice any stutter at all. Overall, I'm actually quite impressed with how well this did, despite how unplayable Rise of the Tomb Raider was at anything higher than a resolution of 800 by 600, and how bad GTA 5 at 1080p was. Issues aside, the 2GB version of the 5570 is able to run some older / easier to run games at 1080p at playable levels of performance as long as you overclock it. Heavier games though need to drop to 720p, and in the case of Rise of the Tomb Raider as low as the resolution will go. But the fact of the matter is that GTA 5 and Rise of the Tomb Raider are indeed playable if you're willing to give up graphical quality, and given how cheaply it can be bought at the likes of CEX in the UK, at least when it comes back in stock anyway, it's a relative bargain. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/Benching&Gaming or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. Thanks for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.